Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Caitlin Fowler. I'm a Senior Research Associate at Evidence for Democracy. For those of you meeting us for the first time, E4D is the leading nonprofit organization promoting and advocating for the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making in Canada. We use original research, issues-based campaigns, and skills training to engage and empower citizens to better interact with evidence and to cultivate public and political demand for evidence-informed decision-making. The session that you've all tuned into today is part of our Evidence Matters campaign. The purpose of this campaign is to build a common language of science and provide people with the tools they need to better understand and ask for evidence. You can find more information about the campaign at evidencematterstome.ca. My colleague Nada was going to drop that in the chat, and all of our content is available in both English and French for that campaign. The campaign is funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage, so we would like to thank them for their generous support. Now, before I go any further, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you all today from Ottawa, which is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And our panelists and moderator are joining us from a number of different regions, home to their own Indigenous communities. You can learn more about the territories, languages, and treaties of the Indigenous people whose land you live on at nativeland.ca. Nada will also drop that in the chat. I also want to recognize that our panel focuses on today's youth and their future in our society. Indigenous youth face innumerably more barriers that challenge their future than the youth of settlers as a result of historical and continued colonialism. So I encourage you all to seek out and support initiatives like Inspire, which Nada will link to in the chat, which invests in the education of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis students. A couple of housekeeping notes before I pass things off to our moderator, Joyce. There are both chat and Q&A functions available. To keep things simple for everyone, we ask that you reserve the chat for comments, or if you'd like to share relevant resources or links, and please put any questions that you have into the Q&A. Closed captions are also enabled for this session, so you can just navigate down to the bottom, and there should be a little CC button that you can click if you'd like to access those. So with all of that, I'm thrilled to introduce Joyce Grant, who will be moderating the session today. Joyce is an award-winning children's author with 6 books, including her latest, Can You Believe It? How to Spot Fake News and Find the Facts. Excellent, thank you, Joyce. This awesome book walks kids through the basics of what fake news is, who makes it and why, how it's different from real journalism, and much more, all in an accessible and highly entertaining format. Nada will also drop the link to that in the chat if you want to check it out. So Joyce is a freelance journalist and editor and a part-time communications professor at Humber College. She knows about how to spot fake news, and she has good advice about how to talk to kids about challenging news. Since 2010, she has made news accessible for kids through her award-winning website, teachingkidsnews.com. And for all of these reasons, Joyce was a no-brainer to moderate this session, during which we will talk with a number of experts about ways to help youth develop the necessary skills to navigate the intersection of science and democracy. And with that, Joyce, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. This is gonna be an exciting chat. And thank you, Evidence for Democracy, E4D, as I call it now, because I'm one of the cool ones. I can call it that now. I want to give a bit of context to our discussion today, okay? Because when I'm not a scientist. We're going to have a lot of scientists here, I know. But when we talk about evidence, I just want to kind of contextualize this before we get into the actual panel discussion. So we're going to be talking about the need for good evidence and the need for everyone, including young people, to understand why it's important and how to access it. So by evidence, we mean information. Information, if you want a definition, information that supports or contradicts an assumption. And that evidence, of course, can change as we learn new things. And that's going to be important in our discussion, as you'll see. So talking about this evidence is important because it's information that is used to make decisions that affect all of us. So that could be by government, as simple as how much they charge for transit or nutrition guidelines or mask mandates, those kinds of decisions. Or it could be companies. For instance, if your skincare product, you've done 15 studies that show that there's absolutely no effect from your skincare product, but then one study that all of a sudden there's been phenomenal results, and you base your marketing on that last one. how do we get this information? What are you basing those decisions on? Or the media, what information and training do they have to interpret studies, and what studies are they using when they report? And the mass media, let me tell you, when someone on TikTok says that you can use baking soda and liquid detergent and water to get your oven door sparkling clean with just one wipe, I can tell you, by evidence-based learning, that is not a true claim, because it didn't work for me. And then also I wanted to mention that there was a really good study done by Stanford University where they showed young people a series of articles and ads and advertorial. And they said, we want you to tell us which one is an ad, which one is advertorial, and which one is an article, and sort of judge the veracity of these. And the surprising news is that not only were they not great at telling the difference, they didn't care. They didn't care because they said, well, even though it's an ad, it's got good information in it. So there's a bit of an eye-opener for us. And although young people can ask the most wonderful, smart questions, sometimes they don't contextualize things. So that's another thing. So we're going to look at ways, why do young people need to find good evidence and understand the sources that they use, but why it matters, right? And how to help them. So in the audience today, we have more than 70 people, scientists, academics, educators, parents. I hope the chat will be robust because you'll all be sharing information with us and amongst yourselves as well. So we're not the only experts in the room. But speaking of experts, let's introduce you now to our panel of esteemed experts. They've been blowing my mind for the last 2 weeks as we've been prepping for this session. So let's start with Ken Boyd. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Joyce, and thank you, Caitlin and Evidence for Democracy for having me today. So my name is Ken Boyd. I work as the Digital Media Literacy Program Manager at CIVIX. We're located in downtown Toronto. We are a charity that designs free experiential learning programs in both English and in French for teachers to use across Canada in their classrooms to help students develop the skills and habits of informed citizenship. What that means in terms of what I actually do is that I research and develop a number of programs at CIVIX. I'll tell you just a couple of them. One of them is called Control F. This is our online verification skills program. I'll be talking a little bit about that more today, as well as a new program we have under development called Polytalks, which is a program that helps students develop constructive discussion skills to talk about politics and social issues in meaningful ways in the classroom. So excited to be here.
Great, thanks, Ken. And Isabel.
Thanks, Joyce. Hi, everyone. My name is Isabelle Delarie. I'm calling in today from my home office in Saint-Eugène, Ontario, land of the Mohawk, Anishinaabe, Audenosaunee, and Wendat people. The programs I oversee at Let's Talk Science send thousands of STEM university students, college students, and professionals into classrooms and community settings to do hands-on science activities. We reach kids in person and virtually all across Canada. It's work that feeds into Let's Talk Science's bigger goals of using STEM engagement to help kids develop all kinds of important skills like critical thinking and develop an interest in science. And it's also work that helps our volunteers in the STEM community develop skills that will help them prepare them for careers where they are in the future going to help bridge STEM and society. That's all accomplished through free programs that I hope you'll check out.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Isabel. And Suman.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us today. My name is Suman Han. I use she, her pronouns. Calling in from Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation, colonially known as Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I wear multiple hats, so I'll be navigating that as we go through this panel. I'm currently an undergraduate student at the University of Manitoba studying environmental studies with a focus in policy and law. I also work at a youth-led nonprofit called Youth Climate Lab as the climate finance lead. And Youth Climate Lab, I'll be talking more about it as we progress with the panel as well, but we seek to support and strengthen a generation of leaders, young leaders, to really shake up the status quo of climate action. And our vision is for young people, no matter who they are or where they're from, to catalyze transformative climate action in their communities to the highest levels of decision making. And we do this through policy, we do this through climate finance and skills development, and really looking forward to bringing that perspective of how can young people be a part of decision making, and how can young people also inform evidence-based decision making as well. And lastly, I currently serve on the board of directors for the Starfish Canada, which is an organization that celebrates and platforms young people for the incredible work they're doing in their community and also in climate action as well. So excited to bring all of those roles that I play into this conversation, and looking forward to diving in.
That's fantastic. And as Ken mentioned, we'll be talking about the actual programs that these organizations offer a little bit later. But I do encourage you to go to their websites and check it out, because there's some incredible work being done. Okay, so let's start talking first about what information is out there for students. And let's start with Suman. As somebody who most recently from the panel, graduated high school. What were you taught in civic education about how governments make decisions, the need for good evidence, how to get that evidence?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I am still a student, so this is something that I navigate every single day. And I know curriculum varies from province to province on how integrated those conversations around evidence-based decision-making, how do you approach a research question, how do you find accurate information out there? I know that varies by province, but in my experience personally, there's been a focus on, this is the big picture that exists out there. These are the systems that currently exist, this is how they operate, but there's not a lot of emphasis on how young people or people can actually participate in that decision-making. There's less of an emphasis on what are the resources and the supports, and how do you spot evidence, and how do you spot information, and how do you then apply that evidence into participating in decision-making, in conversations around developing policies and things like that. So, and I carried that frustration with me throughout my university degree as well. Now that I'm studying climate policy, I think those conversations again come into play. But again, we are taught more at a highest level of a big picture thinking about, this is what exists out there. These are the systems that you might interact with, but not necessarily about how you as an individual or how collectively we can interact with decision making as a whole. So in our programming around Youth Climate Lab, we ensure that whenever we have any type of conversations around policy, whenever we talk about decision making, that we ensure that young people are on the same page and they are provided the information. So we recently, as an organization, host a lot of sessions around policy jams, when we bring young people together into a room and into a space, and we talk about specific topics. So recently we held one on environmental literacy. So we ensured that the information was out there. We broke it down into as accessible language as possible, get rid of all the jargon, so that everyone, regardless of who they are, what their background is, can understand the topic that we are talking about. And based on that collective understanding, based on the foundational knowledge that we're providing in an accessible manner, we can move forward with discussing what are the gaps that exist, what are the recommendations that can be made from this discussion, so that everyone is informed as we talk about decision making, as we talk about policies that can change how we understand with a specific topic. So it has been mostly through a lot of self-taught learning and interacting with a lot of community-led organizations and advocacy groups that really try to build the capacity of community members to get more involved in this. And I think that is a major gap that we are noticing, and there are definitely room for the government to be more present in ensuring that people individually within educational systems, we understand where the specific roles that we can play, how the different systems that we can interact with as individuals or as somebody, perhaps an advocate who's looking to make change. How do we then push those buttons, and how do we then also move forward on our agendas? And it can't solely depend on organizations such as Youth Climate Lab and all these other wonderful folks joining me on the panel to provide that information, and it should be made more accessible for all.
Yeah, and Stephen, when you start to have these discussions with young people, do you find that at first maybe they don't quite know what they're going to be talking about, but then when you put it in, language that they can understand and unpack all the acronyms and, give them the context, do you find that they just start going? Like, is it exponential?
Absolutely. And I think it also unlocks another part of framework of thinking, because I think something that is really missing from our general public understanding of decision making is what jurisdiction interacts with which system, and how important that plays, that aspect of decision making plays a role in which decision makers we should be approaching, or what are the strategies that we should be using to get our thoughts across and share our insights. So in that recent example that I mentioned around environmental literacy, we were talking about it at a federal level, at a national level, but recognize quickly that there's a lot of conversation about environmental education that's not necessarily under national jurisdiction, and that's more provincial and territorial. So how do we ensure that we can, as citizens, as young advocates who are pushing changes forward, how can we act as bridges between jurisdictions to unlock those interjurisdictional collaborations that might not be functioning as efficiently as it could at the more higher level decision-making tables?
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, and I think it's important to remember that we are at the vanguard of a lot of this. There haven't been these resources, and now all of a sudden everybody is finding, as Sumin said, there's a gap and a gap for this information. So it's coming, and I think that's fantastic. And speaking of, I'm going to ask Isabel and Ken. You work with students and teachers, so what are you hearing from them about the questions they have regarding information and misinformation? And do you find that they're questioning the things that they read and see and hear online? So let's start with Isabel.
Yes, I think the growing public discussion around misinformation is just highlighting for us and the general public what teachers already knew, that teaching critical thinking skills is one of the most important things that happens in schools. Thinking back to my own education, one of the only exams I remember from high school was an exam in French class about comprehension. And we were shown a VHS video about how subliminal messaging worked. There were really preposterous claims in that video. I remember seeing like a sequence of showing the information or the pictures of the ad like bouncing around inside the cranium, and there was this picture with someone with like a big pile of 100 tires or something like that, and it was claiming that this person just went out and bought all those tires based on a sublet being flashed a picture of a tire, those kinds of things. The last question on the exam asked, do you think this is a documentary or do you think this is fiction? And there was like such a buzz around that exam question at recess, and we talked about it like for the whole day, kind of the ideas we had and if we thought it was true or not, because it was presented in that mockumentary style that I think we didn't maybe know as much back then. So, I think that example shows like if it was on the minds of teachers in the 90s, like it still is, and I think it's more than ever. But it's not a new idea for them. I think they're just glad that we're catching up with them. When we do science workshops in schools, we always try to make the science topics we're presenting relevant and connected to current events and so on. So often there will be questions about like, oh, how does this relate to this topic in the news or those kinds of things? And those are really great teachable moments and can make the science topic seem really relevant as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that just because a young person can't unpack the context and the acronyms and the words doesn't mean they're not interested in the topic. And then once you start to take off those layers, again, like you said, you carried the discussion into recess or whatever it was, yeah. Right? You're incredibly interested in, yeah, great. Ken, what about you? What have you heard from teachers and students that you work with?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's in terms of questions I have about information and misinformation. I mean, it's I work to develop programs that are for teachers to use with their students, but what I find is that there's often a lot of teacher education that comes along with these programs as well. So, you know, students are aware of these problems around misinformation. They're maybe not so good at identifying exactly what those problems are, but something that I certainly find from teachers is that they really do have a problem keeping up with the extremely rapid changing pace of the online information environment. So something that's really been a challenge from the point of view of designing learning programs is trying to keep up on what's new. Seems like every day there's just sort of a brand new challenge, and it's hard for teachers to keep up. It's hard for us to keep up. So we find a lot of interest in sort of new developments in the world of misinformation. One of these big ones that we've heard a lot of are things like AI programs that develop just putting out lots of stuff that seems plausible, that's false. People are really interested in, you know, how do we combat these new threats that we see online basically every day. Good.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think there's a lot of interest in it, and there's only going to be more interest in the future. That's right. So let's just clarify, what age are we talking about here? What age are we talking about with young people? And by the way, in the chat, you might want to just say yourself what age you kind of see this happening at. But I just wanted to get an idea of around what age are they questioning what they're reading online, and what age do we need to start implementing this instruction? And by the way, Ken, your information about teachers and the educators themselves and the adults, all of us, is not lost on me. I mean, adults need this as well. So, I mean, the answer is really every age, but what is kind of a sweet spot, would you say? Ken, we'll start with you, Ken.
Yeah, sure. So I think the age at which students need to start learning about getting instruction about sort of finding information responsibly online really starts at the second they start using the internet independently. So there's a pervasive myth that because young people are digital natives, that's to say that they are born into technology, they've never known a world without the internet, and they are very good at using the devices, the physical devices, to connect to the internet. I think most of us have probably had this experience where you've seen a young child just pick up a phone or a tablet and use it just intuitively, and it seems sort of amazing. But the myth is that because they're very good at using technology, that they're therefore good at being online, which is to say that maybe they are good at finding good sources of information or not being misled by misinformation, but it's simply not true. So something that we've found out in doing our research and conducting our own research on our programs is that the baseline ability of students when it comes to identifying false and misleading information online is really no better than adults. It tends to get worse as you get older, but in terms of, say, them and their parents, they're basically the same. And that's surprising to a lot of people because they seem like they're good at computers, right? But because that's just not the case, that instruction really does need to start basically as soon as possible, as soon as they are going online and using it independently.
Yes, that sounds right. That sounds like what it has, you know, dovetailed with my experience as well. Isabel, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think anyone who has a toddler or has had a toddler in their life knows that they have difficulty distinguishing between what's real and what's fantasy. And by the time they start school, they have a lot of that understanding, but it continues to grow throughout elementary school. For example, when I do workshops about dinosaurs in kindergarten, I'll often start by saying, you know, do dinosaurs exist? Do they exist today? And a lot of the kids will say yes. I think they're thinking about live action movies. So you'll hear things like they know that cartoons are not true, but they're not sure like if a live action movie is maybe true. When those types of things happen, it's a really great teachable moment as well. I think it's a great time to start having discussions about how can you tell if something is true, how can you find out what's the truth about something throughout that whole development period in elementary school. there's great tie-ins to the curriculum, as was shared in the chat as well. I think as soon as kids start to consume online content, you should be having these discussions. And one thing you can do is also normalize the process of yourself modeling, like asking yourself if something that you see online is true. At a later age, so high school and so on, you can go a little bit deeper in the science and kind of current bleeding edge science. And there's some, I saw, thank you, Bonnie, for sharing some of the resources in the chat there about how Let's Talk Science does that. So those are some resources tied to a high school symposium we held, which brought together many different speakers talking about misinformation for kids at a high school level. So there's a way to have that conversation at every age.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the conversation changes depending on the age, right? You can start very young, depending on what they're exposed to. And then I think for me, with Teaching Kids News, which is my kid-friendly news website, the sweet spot is sort of 5 to 7. And that's when they're also questioning, you know, and then 8 and up, the conversation gets a bit deeper, right? Like it just changes and the things that you're talking about. So I'm looking at the chat. There's lots of good stuff in the chat. Yeah, continue to please share information in there, because I think that's so important that we'll learn from each other. And like I said, we're on the vanguard, like we're learning from each other. So I guess the next question is, what is the risk? What is the risk if you know, students aren't looking and questioning and thinking critically about what they read online? Yeah, Suman, can we start with you on this one?
Yeah, maybe I will take it in a bit of a different direction than what my fellow panelists will share. I think honestly, when we talk about the term risk, there's a lot of there's a lot of connotation around what the word risk means. But I want to flip it around and talk about the risk of not engaging young people, the risk of not trusting young people to think critically as well. I think there is a tendency to not trust young people's capacity to think critically. And I frequently do think that it stems from the assumption that young people are easily impressionable, that they are still developing those skills of critical thinking, that they need to be guided throughout the entire process. And while I absolutely agree, and there should be more resources and supports that are available to engage young people in this process, there is also the need to provide young people with the autonomy to think critically and form their own thoughts. I think young people are actually leading the conversation around even questioning what we accept as information. So previously, even conversation around global warming, right? The term global warming is less used now. We've transitioned to climate change, but with global warming, there was an understanding that this was just a change in the environment, a change in the climate. But now, as these conversations evolve, we're able to now think about climate change through the lens of equity. We're able to think about it through the lens of justice as well. And there's, I think, a growing movement of young people questioning where our information comes from. So when we don't provide young people with that autonomy of thinking critically and think of the insights that young people are bringing as a risk to perhaps diluting what our understanding of an information might be, then we really lose out on that broader holistic understanding of what information could be. So perhaps an example I mentioned earlier about climate justice and kind of broadening that conversation up. We are now understanding that information is much more nuanced than what it was. It's less just either this or that, because people look at that data, people look at information, and we're able to, and people are the ones who are developing those analyses and interpreting them. So if there are inherent biases such as racism or gender inequity, if those biases were embedded into our developing of information, then that's not really capturing the essence of what information is. And there's a lot of gaps and barriers that come into play when we're talking about interpreting what evidence is. So what Youth Climate Lab, what we try to advocate for really is recognizing that lived experiences are also evidence, and ensuring that conversation, is a part of our conversations around misinformation as well. I think there's a tendency to only stick to empirical data as the only form of evidence that is accepted. But we know now that lived experiences also serve as really incredible, valuable evidence in decision making. So how do we ensure that we are opening up the conversation around what information is, so that young people can really bring in this really critical piece, that critical thinking skill that we were talking about earlier, that we are practicing this, that we do have the skills and resources, and that there should be an increased trust in young people's abilities to bring in those conversations, and not just treat it as a risk per se, but as an opportunity really to unlock how we can ensure that the conversations we're having are much more intersectional, much more interdisciplinary and holistic. And I'll invite the
Absolutely.
others.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that very, very important point. I know that when I talk to some adults and I say, TikTok gives me hope for this, for exactly this, because, even a couple of years ago, something would be posted on TikTok that may or may not be sort of suspect, and then all of a sudden the chat would just be flooded, particularly by young people saying, oh, this is fake. This is totally fake. And here's why. And that kind of made it a norm. And one of the things I think we're talking about here is making these kinds of questions the norm, making it the norm to question, making it the norm to want to, take a step back and talk about that. Thank you, Simon. That's a really important perspective, and I appreciate that. And we've all seen the activism that has come from those, as Isabel said, those playground conversations between young people, and then they start to question things, and then all of a sudden there's activism, and we've all seen it, and it's been phenomenal. So I really do think that it's coming from there. So Ken and Isabel, can we also ask you about why is it that young people need to be able to think more critically these days? Ken, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just to add a little bit on what Suman said. I think it's right that we need to think about what it means to be critically thinking, maybe a little bit differently in the modern informational environment. What you typically get from sort of an older conception, which is that to think critically about some information means that you just look at it very closely and analyze it, and that's sort of what critical thinking is. But the modern informational environment is one where young people especially are just bombarded with information just sort of constantly, and that's very much by design, by the way that social media is trying to exploit this attention economy by getting you to stay on their whatever platform for as long as they want you to, and present you with as much information as they possibly can. So while these kinds of sort of traditional analysis skills of critical thinking, I think are still quite important, really they become sort of the second step, and an important part of thinking critically about the information that one sees, especially online, has to be about figuring out what is worth paying attention to first. So this is, and I'll talk about this a little bit later with the Control F program and some of these skills that we teach. But in terms of sort of what critical thinking, this is something that's always important. But because we are sort of so flooded with a deluge of information sort of every time we go online, part of new critical thinking skills that we need to learn are figuring out, this is the stuff I can ignore, this is the stuff that is really worth engaging with further.
Absolutely. Isabel, do you want to?
The only thing I'll add to those great answers is that the skills you learn as a child, they stick with you throughout life. So by helping kids build these skills, we're also working for them to be more media literate, more science literate in the future, which plays into their role as just citizens and decision makers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think too, we need to look at sort of our role as adults in all of this. And I think anybody who comes in and says, I'm the expert on all of it, and I'm going to kind of hand you the information, I think that's not kind of what's happening. This is all evolving so quickly. And it needs to be a conversation with young people and with adults so that we understand how they think, And, you know, we can give them what they need to sort of go further. And often that's, you know, just context and unpacking things, and then they can sort of run with it. Let's take a look at some specific examples. So I wonder if each of you can maybe give us an example of like a time when there was a claim, a post, an article, a video, and a need for young people to specifically understand that. Or Isabel, can we start with you on this?
Sure. What comes to mind for me is the many, many examples that have come up throughout the COVID pandemic. Um, for example, just understanding how virus travels on little droplets of water, and that a mask has like small little holes that let your breathing coming in and out, but trap those little droplets. And prevent them from being projected onto other people. That's something that can have just having that understanding and judging, you know, does this make sense to me? Does it not? How am I going to find out? That's something that can have immediate consequences on everyday decisions. And especially if you have teenagers, like they're making their own decisions about that kind of stuff when you're not in the room. So having them kind of equipped to think those things through and value the science behind it would be something that really has immediate consequences.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Suman, can we ask you for your thoughts on this?
Yes, I have already hinted to it, but the area that I work in is a lot of climate change and justice work. And I briefly earlier spoke about the need to connect evidence to lived realities and how we need to look beyond just the empirical data when we talk about evidence. I think it's really easy to forget for a lot of decision makers that these aren't just policies or decisions that are being made. It actually impacts people's lives. It impacts their livelihoods, their culture, their language, their connections with their communities. So it needs to be influenced and led by people who are going to be impacted by those decisions. So how do we then ensure that they are able to get to those decision-making spaces? And it ultimately comes down to how can we translate people's lived realities into data, into evidence, so that they can contribute to decision-making in the future. I already spoke about the colonial approach of just looking at empirical data to talk about climate change, and its inability to capture the actual evidence, the lived everyday evidence of what the data around climate change might suggest. So I think there is a role for people in the decision-making spaces and for organizations such as those gathered around here today to ensure that we're making these conversations more accessible, to ensure that we are bringing in people who are disproportionately impacted. And kind of jumping off of what Ken had said earlier about young people being bombarded with information, young people are also excellent connectors. So we're able to connect different ideas together. We're able to find how things relate to each other. And so I think that's a skill and that's an opportunity that we can really unlock to ensure that we can move forward to a more enhanced level of decision making. So how can we transform decision making spaces to be more equitable and talk about decisions that are informed by the actual lived realities of people? And there's multiple examples I can provide around talking about climate adaptation, people who are farmers, indigenous peoples and nations who are actually seeing these, what the science says, carry out in real life in devastating impacts that are costing lives as well. So that's perhaps an example that I can give there.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's important to always remember who's talking and who isn't talking, and how can we bring people into the conversation. Yeah, excellent point. And Ken, can you think of some examples of where it's been particularly important for young people to think critically?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll just maybe speak a little bit more generally. So something that we found when studying how young people evaluate information online is that they're immediately drawn to make evaluations of information on the basis of how plausible they think it sounds. This is something that adults do as well. This is something that we probably all do as a matter of a bad habit, is we read some information and we just say, well, that sounds right, or that doesn't sound right, so I'll accept it or I'll reject it. This is perhaps especially the case when it comes to information that's been politicized. So information that tends to be associated with certain political parties or as a marker of political or social identity. We tend to like information that confirms our values and our identity, our beliefs, and reject information that we don't like. So as sort of an example, there's something that I see a lot is a lot of sort of popular social media figures who people like because of certain kinds of views that they hold or political or social sort of identities that they share, but that speak about issues that they really don't have any sort of specific expertise in. So just to give you an example, I was looking at the TikTok feed of Jordan Peterson recently. He's a very, very popular figure among a lot of people, and people like him for a lot of different reasons because of political or social views that they hold. He speaks very confidently and very authoritatively, but often on issues that he has no specific expertise in. So for example, he has expressed a lot of skepticism about climate change. Now, if you affiliate with Peterson and his views and you like him and you like what he has to say, you are probably going to be more liable to accept that information because it confirms with a certain kind of identity and certain kind of worldview that you have. But he has no specific expertise in this area and is not a good source of information about this. So this is representative of a phenomenon that we see fairly often. It has a name called epistemic trespassing. That's sort of a fancy term for something that I think we've probably all seen, which is basically just what I described, sort of someone speaking very confidently and authoritatively in an area that they really don't have any specific expertise in. And so if we're thinking about what kind of information is it really crucial to stop and look for evidence for, I think these kinds of cases where you have people with who are impressive at giving rhetoric, but that people will accept because they sort of like the general message or the general person, but which you don't have that kind of support for. So I think that's we see that a lot. I think that's really crucial to be looking for evidence in those kinds of cases.
I hope everybody wrote down epistemic trespassing, because I love it when you experience a phenomenon like that and you don't know what to call it. And it's better if you know what to call it. And I'll be definitely making a note of that, because you see it so often. When I was teaching college students, I was teaching about social media writing, and they would often say how much they admire like Joe Rogan. And even though he himself, has said, look, I'm not an expert on these things. I'm not a scientist. Don't ask me for and flip-flops on, his opinions and stuff. But of course, that doesn't get the airplay in their minds as the original comments do. So yeah, definitely. So just continuing on, it's unbelievable some of the programs that you have available, and also how accessible those programs are. In many cases, they're free or are funded, partially funded. So can we talk about some specifics? Since you were just sort of talking about that, could you tell us a little bit about Control F, because that sounds phenomenal.
Sure thing, yeah. So Control F is it's a free program that CIVIX offers. It's aimed for teachers for classes in grades 7 to 12, but anyone can register for the site to take a look at the materials. And like I mentioned before, all materials are available in both English and in French. The idea behind the program is to teach students simple habits and skills to help them better identify trustworthy and reliable sources of information online. So like I mentioned before, when we think about what we need to do in terms of thinking critically about the information we come across online, the first thing we want to do is to find out if that information is really worth engaging with. And that's really sort of the heart of the program, is to teach skills that are part of what's called a lateral reading program. And lateral reading just refers to an act of leaving whatever website or post or app that you happen to see some information on, going and doing some research about it, and then coming back and deciding, is this worth my time? Is this worth engaging with and thinking critically about further? And if that sounds very simple, it's meant to be, because we find that with more complex sort of digital media literacy programs that are out there, the more complicated they get, the less likely they are to be actually adhered to by anyone. So we really focus on are sort of core simple skills that students can use to research claims and sources online, and then come back and say, this is something is worth my time a little bit more, or it's not. So it's something that, again, sort of picking up on something that Suman said before, the point of the program is not to tell students you should believe this or you should believe that. We do want them to have that kind of autonomy, but we want to teach them those kinds of research skills that they lack in order to then go back and see what's worth engaging with.
Yeah, and let them loose, right? Because they know what they need to know. And once they have the ability, they can sort of go for it and answer sort of the things that we as adults don't even know is the issue around that. Isabel, what can you tell us a little bit about Tomato Sphere?
Yeah, so at Let's Talk Science, our whole thing is using STEM as a platform to teach kids things like asking questions, making hypotheses, and testing them. Tomato Sphere is one of my favorite examples of a program that we offer that accomplishes that. Every year we send tomato seeds into space. They spend a few weeks in space in a space capsule. And then they're distributed for free to classrooms across Canada. So any teacher can request tomato sphere seeds. The experiment consists in the kids planting both sets of seeds. So they get both seeds that have gone to space and some that haven't. So that's their control group. So they plant both. They don't know which one is which initially. And they compare the germination rate of those two sets of seeds. Then at the end, when they submit their data to the website, that's when they find out which seeds went to space and which ones were just kind of regular tomato seeds. Their data is then aggregated, and it helps us understand the effects of space conditions on germination and eventually laddering up into agriculture, thinking about eventual agriculture in space. So, those are all exciting topics to think about, but for us, one of the main purposes of that project is to teach the process of scientific inquiry. So how do you formulate a hypothesis? How do you test it? What does a blind study mean? It really helps familiarize kids with both the terminology and the processes of science that they're going to encounter when they see studies discussed online, or, when they want to themselves test out and see if something is true or not.
Yeah, that's a good point, that the scientific method is a great way to apply thinking about misinformation, testing it. And then, as you mentioned, when we were prepping for this session, if things change, to be able to shift your hypothesis. And it doesn't mean that all of a sudden, oh, that's misinformation, you were wrong all along, right?
Yeah, it just means that now and you know something new, and you can revise your thinking on it. So just getting them engaged firsthand in that process, I think, can help them process what they're seeing happen in the larger environment.
Excellent. So, okay, so we have so much more to talk about here, but I think we need to move into, just for time, we need to move into some of the questions. And I apologize, I've been watching the chat and it's been fantastic. I haven't overlooked anything. It's just that we've been so involved with some really interesting things. Caitlin, do you have a question that you can pull from the Q&A here that we should look at, please?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of them that's really interesting is from Maureen. People often brand themselves as experts, and the lines seem to be quite blurry on this designation. How do you teach children to discern who is an expert, which can be in the eye of the beholder, especially when they use impressive titles or affiliations to organizations?
Okay, that is a great question. I would love to get Suman's thoughts on this. Correct me if you don't want to be the one to tackle this, but Suman, how do you feel about that? Could you give us your thoughts?
I'll perhaps connect this a little bit to Leigh's question that is also listed there. I don't know if folks have, I don't know if folks are able to view this, but Leigh also asked, perhaps I'll just read it out loud, and please free to stop me at any point if you feel like I'm going off track. But Lee mentioned further to Suman's comments about evidence versus lived experience. Decision makers don't always make evidence-based decision, hence the need for E4D for many reasons. At the same time, personal stories can have a powerful effect on policymaking. How can we merge together personal and evidence to ensure science-based decisions are made at higher levels? I do really want to note that our stance as a lot of young people is that we already have the knowledge and we already have the insights. And as Ken and Joyce, you mentioned earlier, it's really about letting young people loose, letting us really be a part of the decision-making table. I think we also need to talk about what it means to be an expert. And there are folks who really feel confident in their position as an expert, but we also need to recognize that no one can be an expert at everything, and that we always need collaboration to fill in the gaps of what we might not know. And this was definitely mentioned earlier when we had the conversation with my fellow panelists here, but recognizing how we frame and how our positionality also interacts with evidence and with decision making is something that we need to take some time to unpack and reflect as well. There are folks who might state that they are experts at something, and I think Ken mentioned a lot about that term, something trespassing. I don't recall what it was, but I will be looking that up later as well. But also recognizing that a lot of people aren't entitled to that title because of their evidence not being seen as valid. So we talk about storytelling as a form of evidence. We talk about lived experience as a form of evidence. Those people are experts, right? But they're frequently in a lot of decision-making tables aren't afforded that position as an expert. So how do we ensure that when we are having conversations, what do we mean when we talk about experts? Are we only talking about folks with the educational backgrounds? Are we talking about folks who just brand themselves as an expert? And there needs to be an unpacking of how power dynamics are also interacting with that, and then ensure that that a broader effective expertise is applied to who is involved in decision making, who is a part of leading conversations around it. And I think ultimately, again, going back to what I have been mentioning frequently at this point, how do we better and how do we transform decision-making spaces to be more equitable so that a diverse understanding of expertise can come together, and recognizing that no one person is an expert at everything and that we need collaboration, we need to be challenged, and that we need a diversity in thought and level and different insights to come together so that we can make effective decisions together.
Absolutely. And just because somebody is more confident or louder doesn't mean that they're more of an expert. And the same as just because a voice isn't being heard, that doesn't mean there isn't an expert there. There's lots of systemic reasons why people are not included in the conversation or are not brought out as experts. Ken and Isabel, can you talk to that about finding experts? Sure. Where, it's not just what they say, but it's the source, who is saying it, that needs to be talked about here. Isabel.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I really love what Simon was saying. I think it's important to always remember that there are different ways of knowing, and that should all be acknowledged and all brought into the discussion. To Maureen's question, the situations that really bug me are when people are using the trappings of science and scientific titles and so on to push their opinion forward. That's usually when there's like something to hide behind that. Every year there's a study that comes out that asks, who do you trust in? Yeah, who do you trust in general? And scientists always show up near the top of that list, which is good. It's never 100%. Also good. I think there is always a lot of concern of, what does it mean that people don't 100% trust scientists? But actually, that's probably a good thing, because you have a lot of people out there, and again, COVID has presented a lot of opportunities for that, using titles, using institutions, and so on, that sometimes don't really support the expertise that they're purporting to have. So the question is, always do have a little bit of skepticism about how someone is presenting themselves as an expert. But the question is, how can you tell? Again, I think that having a scientific mindset can help with that. So if I approach a claim scientifically, like I'll ask myself, why do I believe this claim that's being presented in this video or that article? Like, is it because of where it's being presented? So I'll kind of break my belief into parts like that. Is it because of where it is? Is it because of who is presenting it? So let's check all those assumptions. So those kinds of thought patterns of checking your assumptions, breaking down something into smaller pieces and analyzing each one, like those are all parts of the skills of science that we try to teach. So, applying it to a situation like that, like, okay, this person has doctor in front of their name. Where does that come from? Are they a medical doctor who's commenting on something that of medical importance, or is it like a different kind of doctor that maybe knows about a different kind of thing, but is using their title in kind of a unusual way in this situation? So I think those types of things and encouraging kids to develop research skills and to kind of look, okay, well, I see the name of this institution. What exactly is it? So that kind of reflex and having people be empowered that they can actually reason these things out for themselves is really good, while still balancing out to like, it is useful to hear from science and scientists, and you do, your own research can't totally replace it. So kind of balancing those two things is what's really important.
Yeah, fantastic. Exactly. And that things are becoming more nuanced too. We have to not just say this person is or isn't an expert. This person may have something to add, but then again, we may need to question that too. Ken, do you want to talk to this point about experts? And I think we need to wrap up fairly soon. Is that right, Caitlin? What's our time looking like?
Yeah, I'd actually, if it's all right with panelists, I'd love to take like a 30-second answer from you folks about Bob's question. So Bob said, obviously we need to educate youth, but let's recognize that parents can have a real impact on how their kids assess the information blizzards that they face. Can you visualize practical programs for adult civic literacy and critical thinking skills in order to assist their kids? So like a 30-second soundbite on this, because I do want to wrap it up so we're not taking up too much of folks' time.
Okay, let's start with Ken on that.
Sure. Can I envision these strategies? Yes. I think the kinds of strategies that we teach to students, as I mentioned, lateral reading skills, sort of really basic kind of internet research skills, I think these are applicable not only to students, but to adults as well. So if this is something that we've seen that students have taken these skills back to their parents as well, there are skills, there are programs, there is research to suggest that we can help parents get better at this, and hopefully they can also pass that on to their kids.
Excellent. Isabel.
Yeah, so one of the ways in which I've come to understand better a lot of topics is by teaching them to kids. So what I would say is don't miss any opportunities. If a child in your life asks you a question and you don't know the answer, just jump right in and say, I don't know, let's find out together. Whether that leads you to a little online research project, or doing an experiment together to seeing like which ball bounces the highest and things like that. So I think let's find out together is a really perfect question to be asking yourself.
That's awesome. Suman.
I'll keep it really short, recognizing that no one person is an expert, as I mentioned earlier, and continuing to challenge why we think the way we are thinking, why we accept information, why we don't accept information, and continuing to challenge ourselves by asking the questions, by reaching out for different perspectives that exist out there. There's so many resources that exist out there, so try to gain and really increase that deposit that you have of different perspectives and just constantly questioning things.
Yes, excellent. And I know I held up my book when this question came up initially, because Book Riot just did a little blurb on my book and included it with other books where you can use a book like this as an adult. And I encourage you to do that, because just because it has pictures doesn't mean that the information isn't valid. I often love drawing on nonfiction for kids for these kinds of discussions. Anyway, I'd like to thank all of the panelists and the absolutely stellar audience. We will be looking through the chat. Don't worry, your questions have not gone amiss. We'll all be looking at them. And I'd really like to thank Caitlin and everyone at E4D for the phenomenal work they do and for putting this panel together. Kudos to you. It's been fantastic. So Caitlin, take it away to wrap up, please. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So yeah, just a really quick thank you to everybody who joined us today, as well as our panelists and Joyce. It was a really, really engaging discussion, and everybody who contributed in the chat and the Q&A feature. Thanks so much for contributing to the conversation. I do want to add one quick thing. If you do want to engage with us on social media, we can also help tag some of the panelists. If we didn't get to your question or you do want to ask these folks something, go on Twitter, go on Facebook, find us. We want to continue this discussion kind of throughout the campaign as well. I do want to mention that Joyce and her publisher, Kids Can Press, are actually providing a few copies of her book for us to kind of raffle off towards the end of the campaign. So if you are interested in winning a copy, use the hashtag Evidence Matters. I'll just drop it in the chat, and that will enter you into a draw that we'll do on Evidence Day on March 29th. And then last but not least, you will receive a short feedback survey after you sign off. So please take a minute to complete it. Let us know what you think so we can improve for future events. That's kind of all of the content that we have for today. So again, thanks so much for joining us. And you can check out a recording of this on evidencematterstome.ca or our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.